we have. Assisting me in the opining, my titans of tumult. First, Amy Ridenour, chairman of the National Center for Public Policy Research. Amy, good to have you back. How are you?
Doing great, Alan. Thank you.
On board as well, about Weiner, Democratic strategist, columnist, and former communications director for Clinton drug czar General Barry McCaffrey. Robert Weiner is also former communications director for Clinton drugs, for Congressman Rangel of New York, as well as Conyers of Michigan. Good to have you back, Bob. How are you today?
I'm good, Alan, but we will have some tumult tonight, I think.
Just a little bit. Actually, Bob, I'll stick with you on this one. At the press conference today, the president also said that the Affordable Care Act is not just a website. Now, Bob, doesn't it sound as if he's just trying to distance his pride and joy from one of its many embarrassing relations?
Well, Alan, as I emailed you, it's okay if you delay the implementation requirement, if you delay the penalty for the same amount of time that it takes to get this website up and to speed. But you keep the overall law in place so you don't deny millions health care unless you have a piece of legislation that's better and covers as many people as an alternative and has a funding mechanism and is ready to be voted on and offered on the floor. Even many Republicans have said that. As weak as the rollout is, so is the fact of non-existence of a killer weakness by the Republicans of not having an alternate bill. Whining is not a policy.
Well, Amy, my understanding is that there have been a number of alternative plans, but they really haven't caught the spotlight very much. Now, Obama adds that we're already benefiting from the law anyway. In other words, you can stay on your parents' policy until you're 26. He added that mammograms are free, but Amy, these benefits aren't really free if most conventional policyholders have to foot the bill through their own increased premiums, courtesy of Obamacare, or am I off the mark here?
You're on the mark because nothing is free. I mean, for healthcare to be free would mean that we had made doctors and nurses and everyone in healthcare, including device manufacturers and drug makers and inventors, slaves so that they didn't have to be paid. They just worked for us and it was all free. And, of course, that's not the case, nor should it be the case. Obamacare is a disaster. I mean, the things that people say they like are things like this. Let your children, of course, by the time they're 26 years old are no longer children, stay on your insurance. What people rarely mention is that before Obamacare, children could stay on your insurance until they were 25. Obamacare made it 26 just so they could run around saying, look what we did, look what we did. So, how much difference does it make? Although, admittedly, with the unemployment rate the way it is, for a lot of kids, the only way to get insurance into their 20s is to stay at home with mommy and daddy. But that's another problem with this administration and beyond.
What about what Bob said earlier? I want to know, what do you think about what Bob said earlier? He mentioned that the GOP really haven't come up with an alternate plan. Now, I've spoken to a number of congressional leaders myself. They said, Alan, I put this bill forward, I put that bill forward, but that may very well be. But these bills apparently were never put forward enough for it to be saliently enough exhibited for anybody to really notice, yes?
Well, let me just point out.
Let Amy answer. Go ahead, Amy. Amy, go ahead.
And yes, they haven't gotten the publicity that they should have, but there have been many plans, including one about 3 weeks ago from the Republican Study Committee, which is an association of conservative members of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. Dozens and dozens of them have put together a formal plan. You can get to it by just going to the Republican Study Committee on the Internet. But the GOP-led House has not yet actually formally put out a bill there and then had the House vote on it. Yes, not this year, but there have been in the past. And take a look too.
I want to.
When you say wait, Bob, excuse me. When you say in the past, do you mean like in 08 or 09 or 2010?
I'm sorry, I don't remember the years, but they did them throughout the 90s. Remember, we had this whole debate with Hillary Care.
Right.
Okay,
let me get back to Bob real fast. Bob, even if there is Bob, Robert Weiner, Alan Nathan talking to you. Even if Amy can't muster and nobody can muster an example in which the GOP-led House has offered one, in no way, shape, or form diminishes the fact that Obamacare has on its own proven to be less than glorious, and with a rollout such as this, looking pretty disastrous at the outset, I think it's reasonable to ask that, hey, if something is comparatively simple as the website can prove so problematic, isn't it reasonable to ask what's going to happen with all the other components which are comparatively far more involved and complex?
Well, I'm not going to leave.
Would you acknowledge that that's a reasonable concern, Bob? If the website was screwed up, what about other parts?
I agree with that, but she did not
Thank
answer
you.
the fact that there were 41 votes to repeal, and not once was an alternative offered on the floor at the same time. So that's aside from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how's the play?
Look, just sitting here, I stuck Republican health care plan.
Yeah, and did you get the votes up on it?
And what
Bob, with all due respect, it's a disconnect. It's a
quite
disconnected
a lot of
measure.
Oh, okay.
It's a disconnected measure. You can.
Right.
Let me help you both out with this. The following two things are not mutually exclusive. The GOP should have come up with an alternate plan.
Yes.
But that is so dramatically and breathtakingly trumped by the disastrous plan that the Democrats passed all on their own without one GOP vote. And why are we facing all these calamities? Because you douchebags were so frightened of Scott Brown, who was going to ensure that if this thing ever went to a House Senate Conference Committee and then went back to the respective chambers, Scott Brown would have voted it down. So what you did was you took the Senate plan and you forced the House to vote on it and it only. Is it no surprise to anyone that we found ourselves stuck with an avoidably inferior plan because no additional work was ever permitted on it? Covering a number of things here today, Obama says the failed rollout of healthcare.gov is unacceptable, but you got to wonder, what about the 3-year promise saying the rollout would be smooth? And will this lead to the individual mandate getting delayed for a year, as Obama delayed it for businesses? Of my guests today, one of them says that it'll just be delayed to the extent that the computer is found to be at fault for that delay. So for whatever length of time the site proves to be unmanageable, is pretty much going to be the length of time that the president would delay the plan. This, according to Bob Weiner, Democratic strategist, columnist, and former communications director for Clinton drug czar General Barry McCaffrey, who's joined by Amy Ridenour, chairman of the National Center for Public Policy Research. Amy, let me run this one to you. Obama said today that all folks can now get health insurance, but since only 17% are without insurance, while 70%, that's 70%, are perfectly happy with their existing health care, isn't it all surprising that we have such residual animus against the Affordable Care Act? I mean, was there really no better way to have done this other than to let the political few dominate the average many just to accommodate the selected? Your take.
Yes, there were many different ways that this could have been done. There are many people who believe this was done badly on purpose in order to lead the way to a single-payer health care plan, which would admittedly be worse. But, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet today, and I think we really need to, is that tomorrow morning there's going to be a decision handed down by a federal judge as to whether the 34 states that have not signed up for Obamacare, in other words, the 34 states that aren't part of this at this point because they weren't required to under the terms of John Roberts' decision in the last time we went to the Supreme Court, that if that is the case, that tomorrow morning the federal judge puts down this particular ruling, no one in those 34 states will be able to get subsidies for their health care. So that is going to be such a big, and I think it could very well happen. I mean, what's going on tomorrow is an injunction request. So
are you talking about How Big versus Sebelius in West Virginia?
I'm talking about the case about how the Internal Revenue Service, the way the law is written in Obamacare, the only people who are eligible for a subsidy are the people who buy insurance from a state exchange. 34 states said they didn't want to make an exchange and have not. The IRS last year just put out a rule and said, doesn't matter what the law says, we're going to give you the money anyway. Well, that's very unconstitutional. The IRS does not have the authority to give money away. Congress has to do it.
I know, but for some reason the administration is still backing the IRS's play on this, even though it does run contrary to the Constitution. Bob Weiner, to you, look, regardless of what position you're on this thing, the law is the law is the law. Are you at all concerned that the administration is actively working against that very law?
Well, the administration isn't working against the law. The administration is trying to implement the law and broaden health care to as many people as can possibly get it so that the insurance companies don't deny coverage. That's what this whole
but the
thing was
Supreme
about.
Court's already ruled that the government cannot leverage Medicaid payments to states and threaten to withhold those payments as leverage to convince these states to go along with these exchanges.
Actually, what the federal court did was say it's optional for the states to do Medicaid, but even Rick Scott and Arizona governor, the two that are vehement anti-Obama people, have said that they are going to do the Medicaid because they get 100% federal funding for the first 3 years and then 90% after that. So it's like Medicaid when it first came in. Arizona held off in a couple states, but they finally all came in because it's federal funding. So, of course, they're all going to come in finally.
Amy, your estimation, though, the administration is still breaking the law in a very specific way. Please elaborate.
Well, yes, absolutely. And tomorrow morning in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, federal judge is going to hand down a ruling in an injunction request specifically saying that since the law as written, this is the one that the Democrats wrote and passed exclusively, they specifically wrote that the only people who can get a subsidy for health insurance are those who purchase it on a state exchange. 34 states didn't set up a state exchange. So the IRS put out a rule that said, well, we're just going to ignore that. Go ahead and buy it from the federal exchange. The thing is, the IRS doesn't have that authority. So some people, some small business owners and some individuals went to federal court. They said this is unconstitutional, and they asked for an injunction blocking Obamacare. This is a big deal. I don't know. I think the news media not covering this just shows how little they actually give a darn about the facts of the case.
Well, they are.
Oh, that's very, very important.
Actually,
Let's give a summary for the people. Okay,
tomorrow morning, there may be an injunction that says nobody gets subsidies in 34 states of the union. If they don't hand down the injunction, then it still goes to court, which means the 34 states may still not get the subsidies. Now, what the liberals were doing with Obamacare, among other horrible things, is they wanted to make people dependent on subsidies so this horrible thing could never be repealed.
Well, Amy, let me ask you real fast. So, Bob, give me a second. Amy, and I'm going to give it to Bob for a soliloquy, I promise. But Amy, real fast, what is it that the IRS is getting, just so people understand, what is it that the IRS thinks it's getting by forcing these states to accept subsidies whether they like it or not?
What it thinks it's getting, I would have to think nothing, because the IRS's job is to collect taxes. They have made basically a policy decision pretending that they have the authority. I assume that this is an assumption, that it's the only logical one, is that the administration, which is the executive branch, said, do this. And, of course, they report to Obama, so they did. But that doesn't mean they have the authority, or that if this makes it to the Supreme Court, and I expect it would, that the Supreme Court wouldn't say, yeah, well, you're right. Congress has to do
right. Now, Bob, I'm going to give you that soliloquy because the president said that the act will that this Affordable Care Act will let folks be covered by Medicaid if they're in a state that accepted federal funds for it. Now, those states not accepting funds did so because they saw those dollars eventually disappearing, thus leaving the states holding the bag for yet another partly unfunded mandate. Do you see that dynamic changing anytime soon, Bob Weiner?
Well, I'm going to read from when Amy says it's not covered in the media. Forbes magazine, will the courts derail Obamacare? And then it says that critics argue that the courts could not justify setting aside the entire law based on such a procedural nuance. I know that everybody on the right wished that John Roberts had also ruled against Obamacare, but he didn't, and I don't see it happening.
But he did rule against Obamacare as Obama predicated its justification along with Nancy Pelosi. All those folks based it. Well, let's not forget this little gem. All the folks who supported the Affordable Care Act did so predicated on the belief that they could do so with the Interstate Commerce Clause. Now, it's true, the Interstate Commerce Clause has always authorized Congress to regulate interstate commerce, but it has never authorized Congress to create the very commerce it would then get to legislate. That's, of course, and as well as regulate, because that's, of course, a maneuvered self-fulfilling prophecy with a catch-22 ending. However, all that notwithstanding, they did find that it was constitutional based on it being a tax. But here's the problem for the president and all of his following. Every one of them insisted for months and months and months that the Affordable Care Act was not a tax. And then it's found to be constitutional for the very reason they claimed it was not. That's the irony here.
I just think that Amy is going to be very disappointed in the ruling tomorrow because the court is not in a mood to totally derail a congressionally passed piece of legislation that made this law acceptable.
They only have to concern themselves with the narrow focus of a particular component. The subsequent ramifications thereafter, that's up to the universe. The court only has to look at what's in front of it.
That's a statement. The court isn't stupid. They don't operate in a vacuum. And if they realize it would derail the entire bill, they're not going to let it happen.
They may not operate in a vacuum, but they also don't operate with omniscience either, nor omnipotence. They're not accountable for being almightily all-knowing. They get to narrowly look at the case before them, and quite often they're happy to do just that so as to dodge a lot of what you just referenced. I think they're motivated in the antithetical fashion, not in the one you raised, but that's just me. I could be wrong, but it's a rarity, so we won't even discuss it. Amy Ridenhour, Bob Weiner, always a blast. Thanks again, guys. Folks, you're listening to The Alan Nathan Show right here on the Main Street Radio Network.